What is going on, gunfighters, survivalists, or those aspiring to be so? Welcome to the podcast. I haven't decided yet whether this is going to come out on Alpha Male podcast or Gunfighter Life podcast. I do both podcasts by God's grace, and every once in a while I get a topic that is germane to both. Whether it'll come out on one and or the other, which one first, I don't know. But either way, welcome. Let's discuss this. The right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values. With that, so you know that I have some kind of credibility that I've been blessed with, this is not just because I got a bunch of followers on Instagram or famous YouTuberist or something like that. Like, it's actually grounded in some actual credibility. With that, I'm going to put in a bio. If you don't care, just listen to anybody with a microphone or you've heard it before. While you're fast forwarding, like, subscribe, leave a review of the podcast. Consider hitting the link for Patreon. There's a lot of really cool content that's just available on there. With that, the bio and then the main topic. Hunting, fishing, foraging for survival. I'll roll into a quick abbreviated bio and then into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one in my life. I grew up hunting and fishing in the backwoods of the southeastern United States at a very early age. Some of my earliest memories are with firearms. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. By God's grace, He got me through that safely. After that, I served as an instructor, an urban warfare instructor and a desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. I also served with the LAPD, both full-time as a sworn police officer and in some more specialized assignments, as well as serving in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. I've been a FBI firearms instructor, still am an FBI firearms instructor, have been for a lot of years, also NRA certified and some other three-letter government agency certified. I've been a private contractor for a three-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. By God's grace, He got me through all that in one piece, not because I'm better, but because He chose to have grace and mercy on me. I've been a professional hunter and guide. Professionally hunted things like buffalo and elk. Not many people today can say they've done that, but I'm blessed to be able to say that I have. I've hunted everything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast and elk and bear and wolf and slain all manner of beast. A state rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different disciplines. Enough about me, guys. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. Let's get into today's topic. Alright, so you've heard a little bit about my background. That said, I do not see the future. I don't pretend to be a prophet. I definitely don't want to be a false prophet. There's a pretty stiff penalty for those in the Bible. I don't see the future. I don't know what will happen. I do know there will be great tribulation. I do know that whether you're a student of the truth, the actual Word of God, the Bible, or history or science, they all converge on this matter. Civilizations collapse. That's what they do. Whether the next one is the big one, the Great Tribulation, or a speed bump along the way, the Black Death, mass, mad, mutually assured destruction, nuclear war, zombie, AI, chipmunks, whatever your thing of the apocalypse is, I don't know. I don't see the future. Some of these things may not apply. I'm going for a broad spectrum, like grid down. Food is not readily available at the shelf. You can't just go to the store and buy food in a box wrapped in cellophane, etc. Have to have some way to get food other than at the store with, digital currency or green paper currency. You have to have some other way to procure food. This came, to give credit where it is due, I asked for questions on Patreon, but you didn't have to sign up to pay to be a member. I just asked the general public, if you were on Patreon, for episode ideas. The Gentleman Warrior submitted this. Hunting for feeding the family, not just sport. Small game, waterfowl, big game. Best cartridges and firearms for all. Best if they can be used for dual purpose of hunting and protecting the family. How much small game, waterfowl, big game would be needed to feed a family for a season? So I'm going to go through a lot of this, and then at the end I'm going to kind of pee in your Cheerios. So if you don't like that, if you just want to be told how awesome the apocalypse is going to be and how I'm going to reinforce some kind of prepper fantasy, just when I get to that point, just turn it off or whatever. But the first part of this, you have to realize this, even if you are a hardcore hunter, and I am a hardcore hunter, I love to hunt. I've taken lesser paying jobs, I've moved across the country to live in what I consider the still Wild West, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, northern Utah region. I could get a higher, more prestigious job maybe somewhere else, a lot more private contracting jobs in more populated areas, because I love, stalking elk in the bush, in the wilderness. I love that. And I really do. It's a big part of what I enjoy in life, being out in the wilderness, enjoying God's beautiful creation. That said, the way that we hunt today is almost exclusively for sport. You may eat the meat. I love the meat. I hunt for the meat. But the way that you are legally allowed to hunt is almost exclusively today for sport, although you eat the animals. Let me explain before you get all up in arms. I grew up a poor boy in the South. I'm not saying I'm proud of this. I'm saying I was poor and I didn't really give a crap about the fish and game laws. I grew up poaching. Just there. Statute of limitations is probably up. I'm not advising you do that in a grid up left of event scenario. I'm saying in a survival situation where there are no fish and game laws, hunting is going to look far different. So if you've got it in your head that in the apocalypse you're going to be sitting on a tree stand wearing blaze orange, waiting for, that nice 8-point buck to walk out, realize that's how people hunt for sport. If you want to get deer for food, you walk into a field in the middle of the night with a flashlight or headlights and you shoot a deer in the face. You might shoot several deer in the face. You're not doing it for sport, you're doing it for food. If you're going to hunt waterfowl, which is a great source of calories and fat, if you're in an area that has an abundance of them, you're not going to sit there, and drag out $1,000 worth of decoys and sit there all day in the freezing cold and shoot one or two when they're coming in, trying to hit them in the air as they're landing or circling or whatever. That's great sport. You're probably going to wait till several at once have landed on the water. Then you're going to shoot them. You're not going to bother to use environmentally safe bunny hugger steel ammo. You're just going to use lead ammo because it's cheaper and more effective. If you are going fishing for food and not sport, and I like sport fishing too, but it's a different thing. It's for fun. It's recreation. Sure, I like to eat the fish that I get. I like a nice deep dark colored salmon as much as the next man. I like fighting them on a rod and reel. But that's probably not what you're doing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to be out there in the apocalypse in a $50,000 bass boat running around with a rod and reel trying to catch fish. Make a trot line. Make several trot lines. A trot line, if you don't know, is a long line, maybe depending on the size of your quarry, a large bank line, like tarred bank line. Every 18 inches or so you get a swivel attached to there, and then you have a set of leaders and hooks that you bait up with whatever's appropriate for the fish you're trying to catch. Let's say you got 10 trot lines with 10 hooks apiece. You throw those all out there. You check them the next day. A lot of fish will get off, but the ones that don't, you eat, and their guts and stuff like that you use for more bait for more fish. There's similar ways to do that if you're talking about a small pond with jug fishing. You just throw like a milk jug or any kind of floating container with, depending on how long you want it, a piece of fishing line that's baited, and then since it's not a very deep pond, you go the next day and the ones that are moving around, you wait out there and you grab them and you haul the fish in. If you're talking about small inland streams and you got limbs that overhang, you just literally tie a leader or just a piece of monofilament to a hook on the limb and hang it in the water, and do that a bunch. Now, I did grow up commercial fishing. That's a whole different operation. That usually requires gasoline unless you have like a legit sailboat set up for commercial fishing. I'm not aware of any sailboats equipped like that. You're talking about gill netting, seining. Those are massive commercial operations. You're probably not doing that unless you have a giant group of people doing that. So I'm going to leave that off the table, but there are very effective ways for getting fish. So I hope that illustrates the point that the kind of hunting most people do today for sport is not, if you're dying of starvation or your family's about to die of starvation, if your goal is to get food to not die, the sport hunting is probably not what you're going to be doing. Let's do some fun math, some survival math, some apocalyptic math. America's favorite quarry. Not mine, but in general, most people in America, when you say hunting, they probably picture white-tailed deer. This is from a Reddit thread, and obviously these are not exact numbers. It says here that average male white-tailed deer weighs 150 pounds. That's about average, I think, for, probably bigger than average for Florida, smaller than average for Maine, but you get the idea. 55 pounds of that is viable meat. Venison, 540 calories per pound. If they did that math correctly, and I'm not double checking it, you should do your own research. 30,000 calories. Those 30,000 calories a day, he said a family. So let's do a family of 4, shall we? Divided by 4, that's 7,500 calories per person. If we divide that by 2,000 calories a day. Now, 2,000 calories a day is kind of starvation rations for a active adult male. But women and children, hopefully less. Let's average it out to 2,000 calories, and I think that's being very conservative. 3.75 days. So that average size adult white-tailed deer, the meat, is going to last a family of 4 about 3.75 days. If that math is not rock solid, right? Also, that's eating the meat. Some of my favorite parts of a cervid are the heart, the liver. The brain has a lot of fat. And I've read several accounts, although I've never done this. I've read several accounts from all over, from the Donner Party to My Life with the Eskimo to Sailors Lost at Sea, where they would eat the hide. They would boil and eat hide or leather, even their boots. It's not great, but if you ate as much of that as you could, right? Bone marrow, brain, even hide, you might stretch out another day or two. Which means you need just shy of 100 deer per family of 4 if you were just eating deer. You might say, well, I shoot 1 or 2 deer a year and it lasts my family all year and I got some left over in the freezer. It's probably because you're not just eating deer, right? You're eating meat and potatoes and pizza and, Sonic, whatever the average person eats that I don't consider proper human food. But you get it. A lot of grain, a lot of wheat, a lot of potatoes. You're not just eating the deer. If you were just eating the deer for calories, and granted that math is far from perfect, but that gives you an idea. This kind of bears out when I look up how many deer does a mountain lion eat in a year or kill in a year. 52 a year. Another one says a mountain lion will kill a deer every 4 to 14 days. Keep in mind that's one mountain lion, not a family, that's one. If we look at one of my favorite little delicious protein balls, quail. A quail has 209 calories. If you were just eating quail, that means you would need about 10 a day per person, or 40 quail a day for a family of 4. And again, that may seem like a lot. That's if you're only eating quail. That's if that was your only food source. If that sounds pretty unsustainable, we'll get to that in a bit. There is another big way to feed oneself, and that is foraging. As much as I like hunting, my wife and I probably do more foraging. One, because my wife enjoys it better, and it's just a good time for us to be outside gathering wild food. Two, there's hardly any legislation on it like there are with game wardens. I have to get a tag for this, a tag for the elk, a tag for the deer. Can only hunt it a couple weeks out of the year. Foraging, if it's edible and it's in season, I can usually go pick it. So you would likely supplement your diet that way. They were called hunter-gatherers for a reason. Now, he asked about guns, calibers, something I probably have covered a bunch on Gunfighter Life. And I've said this before, and this may not be as romantic as your post-apocalyptic dream fantasies, but a shotgun. If it's just for hunting, a break-open single-shot shotgun, 12 or 20 gauge, will hunt pretty much anything in North America. Now, if you're talking about, he asked about a crossover, a pump or semi-auto, something with a reasonable rate of fire. From guides in Alaska for bear defense to so many police cruisers around the country. A pump-action shotgun. You can hunt anything from a mourning dove to defend yourself from a grizzly bear and home defense and all that. I've talked about that ad nausea. There is no other small arm available to mankind that is as flexible as the shotgun. 12 gauge is the most common, especially if you live east of the Missouri River, especially east of the Mississippi River. 20 gauge will do just fine. But just by changing ammunition, I can go from a good dove load to a good waterfowl load to a good deer load, whether that be buckshot or slugs depending on the environment, to a great home defense, close quarters combat tool. The shotgun's it. As much as you might love battle rifles, and I do, as much as you may love, big bore handguns, big bore revolvers, those are all cool. I'm not saying they're not cool. They're just not anywhere near as practical as a shotgun. That is your answer. The only other rival would be the 22. And why might you pick the 22? Because you can store and or carry a lot more ammo. I've done whole episodes on this, shotgun versus a 22. The 22 is far less powerful. Again, I would not advise this, and I don't think this is ethical, but if you're starving to death, I don't care how much people tell you that a brain shot or a headshot on a deer with a 22 is always deadly. It's not. But it's deadly some of the times. If you shoot 3 or 4 deer in the head and 1 or 2 die in a timely manner so that you can retrieve them, the other ones go and die of gangrene or infection that you never recover, well, I guess you accomplished your mission. I'm not for using a 22 for deer. I'm telling you, people do it, especially poachers. It's quiet, the ammo's cheap. If you're a poor redneck trying to feed your family, you might ride around at night with a spotlight shining it in fields and shooting a deer between the eyes. That's not really the point. Again, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that is an argument for the 22, and the 22 does excel at small game hunting. The ammunition's a lot more affordable round per round. It's a lot more portable and packable. You can carry a lot more of it. I dare say you could carry, if you were savvy and were doing other things like trapping, trot lining, carry a lifetime supply of 22 ammo on your person. You're not really doing that with many other calibers. You might say the 22 Magnum, and the 22 Magnum would be better in that deer scenario, and a lot of poachers do use 22 Magnum. But it's worse in the other scenarios. If you're shooting really small game, the whole point of you shooting it is to eat it. And if you destroy half of it and lose half of your calories, it's not that survival math just doesn't add up. As much as I like ARs for intermediate, fighting rifles or AK-47s for legendary reliability, they're not very practical in this scenario. Can you shoot a deer with a 223 AR? You sure can. But show me the guy that can consistently shoot, doves and quail and grouse in a manner that doesn't destroy a bunch of the meat. So a shotgun is really your answer. If you decide you want to go the 22 route, if you think you're probably going to have to bug out because you live in a people hive, which I guess we'll get to what that means in a minute, then you might choose the 22 for the portability. If you want, and I love a bolt action 22, I really do. But if you talk about dual purpose, get a Ruger 1022. There's rarely a time where I'll say this make and model is the best, but the Ruger 1022 is. There's really nothing else that compares to it for commonality, for legendary reliability. If you had, I'm not saying that a 22 is just as good as an AR or pretty much most other modern things for a fighting weapon. But if you have to press it into that service, you're much better served with a self-loader, semi-auto, than you are with a bolt action or a lever gun, as much as you think they're cool. So that's really your answer there. There are other reasons you may decide to use something else. A bolt action 22 is a great hunting tool for sport hunting, but you're probably not talking about getting ambushed and cannibalized like you might be in a post-apocalyptic scenario. In that, you might want something a little bit more firepower than a bolt action 22. So a pump action or semi-auto, but if we're talking post-apocalyptic, the pump action has a lot of benefit. The pump action 12 gauge shotgun with a variety of shells, or a Ruger 1022 detachable box magazine, reasonable rate of fire. Right, just those are going to be your best crossover. Now, let me start peeing in your Cheerios. I like to be a student of history. I like to read a lot of books. I can't even probably accurately the number of books that I went through in 2024. And that's just 2024. I've been a pretty voracious reader, some years more than others, throughout my life. Some people think of the war as being like jam-packed action, some kind of action movie. Sometimes it's very action-packed. Sometimes there's months of monotonous boredom ad nausea. Sometimes like that, I might finish a novel in a day or two or three. And some of the things I really like to read are history, like accounts of history, and sometimes accounts of survival, or sometimes they just pluck survival lessons out of history books. One of the ones I recently read was My Life with the Eskimo, where in English, it's a Canadian explorer, or on behalf of the Canadian government, went up into the high Arctic to study Eskimo that had never been contacted by, white Europeans. Plucked a lot of survival lessons out of that book. And that's just one of many. One theme that I've noticed several different places, right, by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. Whether it was, people going up, Americans, shortly after Alaska became a state to live out of the bush off the land, or the indigenous Eskimo, another real good one is, 1491. Not really written as a survival book, but it talks about situation pre and post European contact. Anyway, one of the themes that pops up is they talked about this like small family bands, not even like a whole big tribe. Not talking about like Shoshone or Cheyenne. I'm talking about small family tribes or groups every 20 square miles. I've looked into this a lot, and it really depends, but if you're talking about pre-industrial agriculture or pre-common agriculture, you might be looking at a sustainable population density of 1 or 2 people per square mile. Now, there's a reason I live where I live. I'm looking out, turn around and look out a window right now. I am looking at millions and millions of acres of wilderness. I live here for a reason. I live, off-grid, semi-off-grid as a neo-nomad for a reason. Most people aren't willing to do that. Look at the population density where you live, where your county is. Think, I live in the country. I think because you might live somewhere where people listen to country music or drive a pickup truck, you have an idea that that's like not the city. Let me slap you in the face with some historical stuff here. Think about London, even if you're not English, right? If you think about our culture, our Western culture, you might think about a lot of the things we think of as, you know, medieval Europe. Let's say London in the Middle Ages. London was a massive city and cultural center in the Middle Ages. I looked up the year 1400 because to me 1400 is kind of like the Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. In fact, it gives two numbers here. The year 1086, the population of London was 18,000 people. By the 14th century, it was 45,000 people. Okay, go look up the closest city to where you live and see the population. Even if you are, well, let's say if you're within half a tank of gas, because you got to figure some people are going to be less than half a tank, some people are going to be more than half a tank. I think in a lot of, again, I don't see the future, but in a lot of big disaster scenarios, people are pretty quickly going to flee the city if they can. A lot of those are going to get trapped in the city, probably die in the city. But if you got a city of 1 million people near you within half a tank of gas, let's say 250, 300 miles away, and a fraction of that population, 10%, 20%, swarms the area where you are, what does that population go to? Look up, do your own research, but it depends on where you are and what the flora and fauna, like, you know, a coastal estuary like the Chesapeake Bay or the mangrove swamps of Florida is going to have a lot more biomass than, like, say where I am on the high lonesome prairie. I'll grant you that, but try and get some numbers for what the population density, the stable population density was in that area pre-modern industrial agriculture. Let's say that nobody in this apocalypse even goes around killing each other. There's not even any competition for resources. They just say, we're just going to slowly starve. This is not realistic, but let's just say we're going to slowly starve until the population is at a stable, land sustainable amount. Is that one small family per 20 square miles, like they talked about in some of the books that I read, different independent books that I read in different time periods? A small family every 20 square miles? Is that 1 or 2 people per square mile? Whatever it is, look at what your population density is now. Now, again, I don't see the future. I don't know your apocalypse. If we talk about one of the great apocalypse events that happened, that was European contact with the Native Americans. Unbeknownst to either party, really, the Europeans carried a lot of diseases, and they had a lot, we might think of Europe as just all white people, but I read the book 1491, and it talks about how the European genome is very diverse, and they had a lot of different genetics to fight a lot of different viruses and bacteria and things like that. And since the Native Americans just weren't as diverse genetically, some of the diseases just wrecked their population. I've heard this more than one place. 90% of the population died. 90% of the population died. I heard that in multiple different places. Sometimes dying before they ever even saw a white European, because the diseases traveled faster than the explorers, than the conquistadors or the British or the French fur trappers. Diseases would often wreck a place before the Europeans ever got there, sometimes 100 or 200 years before they ever got there. If you've ever read the book The Stand, kind of what happens, right? Like a massive amount, I forget what percentage in the book, but the vast majority of people just die of some kind of plague or disease right off the bat. And the people that have, they just have that genetic combination where they're immune to it, they're just fine. If that is the scenario that happens, you might see something that happened like here with the buffalo. When you read accounts of the Spanish when they were coming up into North America, this might blow your mind, but the first place one of the Spanish conquistadors saw a buffalo was in a zoo. Yes, the Native Americans had zoos. The Central Americans had zoos, and he saw a bison in the zoo. Bison were not super common. A couple of 100 years later, when the then Americans were moving west, there were bison everywhere. You know why? Very likely because 90% of the hunter-gatherer populations that had been hunting those bison were dead. So they multiplied and multiplied and multiplied in giant swarms of buffalo and beautiful, delicious protein across the landscape. Similar thing. You hear accounts. I just read a book on the long hunters talking about like Daniel Boone going through the Cumberland Gap, killing hundreds of deer at a time with a, front stuffing musket because there were deer everywhere. Why? Because a lot of times on the East Coast, the Native Americans there had been practicing agriculture. They had farm fields and a lot of stuff they had planted that did really well for deer, but they hunted them and kept them at a manageable level. Well, when 90% of your population dies, 90% of the apex predator population dies, the prey population explodes. That's why Daniel Boone and other long hunters like him were able to get literal ships full of tons of deer skins to send back to Europe to make leather, because they were everywhere, because there weren't a lot of people. If that's what happens, yeah, hunting and fishing, that'd be easy if, almost nobody is on the landscape. But here's the thing. If that's not the scenario, or until it is the scenario, a much more recent event, the Great Depression. Now, I don't want to take anything away from anybody that lived through Great Depression. The Great Depression were some hard times, especially we're talking about really modern times. But as bad as the Great Depression was, there wasn't like mass graves of mass people dying of starvation. Even so, during the Great Depression, though there were fishing game laws, people kind of ignored them. I've heard several accounts of east of the Mississippi where deer were almost hunted to extinction. And in some vast amounts of area, they were just no longer on the landscape. The fact that when they started coming back several decades later, you hear the old timers talking about they would go round people up and show them deer tracks so that people would believe that they had seen a deer. Because they were just incredulous that there were deer around, because nobody had seen a deer in decades. Those might be anecdotal, but that was America in the Great Depression in the 1930s. Now I'm looking up, just some data for the population. Population in the U.S. in 1930 was 100, and this is the second place I've seen a similar number, 123 point something million. 123 million people in the U.S. in 1930. Today, it lists, February 1st, 2025, there are 341 million people. The vast majority, something like 80% of that, live east of the Mississippi, which is a very small part geographically of the United States. Now, not all those people are going to hunt, but not all those people hunted in the Great Depression. There were plenty of city slickers that lived in cities that couldn't hunt their way out of a wet paper bag during the Depression. If we go back to those numbers, you're going to have to do some real creative fantasy scenarios in your head to come up where you can actually, the population in your area, if you live east of the Mississippi or the southern half of California or Texas, you're going to have to do some real creative survival math to think that you're even going to somewhat sustain yourself with hunting and fishing, foraging, in a big long-term grid down scenario. I think that's more of a romantic fantasy. Now, what you could do is, now I'm not a farmer. I've grown gardens and stuff before. I'm not a farmer. I know people say they enjoy it. I don't enjoy it. I enjoy living as a nomad. Living as a nomad means, for me, foraging is a lot more attainable than staying in one place long enough to plant and harvest something. But that is absolutely a viable solution. Not the way we farm today in mass. Most of that is dependent on petrochemicals, which probably aren't going to be there during a collapse, and giant industrial machines that probably aren't going to be there in a collapse. Because if you can get gasoline, you can probably get food, right? So if one goes away, the other's probably going to go away because they're very interdependent. Our modern food and farming system is very dependent on the grid. I'm not talking about modern food. And a lot of that stuff is genetically modified. So even if you found the seed and stuff, a lot of it's been genetically modified so it won't self-reproduce. I'm not the expert on that, and that's not everything, but it's a lot. A lot of the America farm soil, from the little I know, is only producing food still because we're spraying it with petrochemicals and fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. You're probably not being able to transport and obtain tons and tons and tons of chemical fertilizers in an apocalypse. Talking about you on a small scale growing and farming real high calorie foodstuffs like potatoes, like wheat, like corn, beans, things like that. Whether you're talking about that or hunting or fishing, here's the thing also. We talked about if everybody just slowly starved to death and nobody was violent against anybody else. What do you think the odds of that are going to be? If it is a mass grid down scenario and people are starving to death, violence generally goes hand in hand with that. One of the books I read this past year was Survival Theory 2. And it was, the first part of the book was a case study of modern mass starvation. I'm not talking about Europe in the Middle Ages or the Black Death or things like that. I'm talking about like Europe in the 20th century, Asia in the 20th century. Like when communists would come in and be like, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to take everybody's land and redistribute it. The problem is the people that got the land that had been producing a lot of food, because they had, middle class farmers that had been doing it for generations that knew how to do it. When they gave it to people that didn't know how to farm, people starved in mass. There was a lot of violence, and sadly, there was a lot of cannibalism. So much so that, people developed different words for different kind of cannibalism. It's not fun to think about, but like they had words like if you dug up a dead person and ate them versus if you killed somebody to eat them. That's the stuff you might be dealing with. And that kind of event, you going to leave your wife and kids at home while you go sit in a tree stand to maybe shoot a deer? Is that the best use of your time? And this is coming from somebody that loves hunting. I love hunting. I love deer and venison, and I moved to a place where I can get, even if I don't draw a tag, I can get over-the-counter elk tag. An elk is a lot of meat. You're talking about a 5, 6, or more 100-pound animal. I got my elk this year in November? December? It's February. We're almost completely out of that elk, and that's my wife and I. I think we may have 1 or 2 things of jerky or biltong left. It's just because we're saving them. And that's not most of what we eat. We eat a lot of store-bought food, eggs, and protein bars, and protein powder, and, things like that. Even so, that elk is almost gone. And we also got blessed to get a deer this year. There's still a little bit of that in the freezer, but that's because, again, we're kind of saving it. If we had just been eating that, it would have been gone a long time ago. So, just some thoughts. Do I think you should know how to hunt? Do I think you should hunt? Do I think you have the skill of hunting? I absolutely do, for so many reasons. I think it's good for a man to be able to feed his family another way besides buying something wrapped in cellophane. I think it's good to spend time out in God's creation. I think there's a lot of tangential skills that goes along with that have served me well in life. Tracking, patience, navigation, being able to walk quietly on a landscape undetected. A ton of good reasons. And there will probably some really good calories obtained if you're a good hunter, because you can't just have the gun, you have to have the skill, right? But probably some really good high quality calories obtained by hunting, fishing, foraging in an event like that. But I wouldn't hang your hat on it. I would have some food stored. If you plan on farming, it might take you a year or two to produce even half of the calories, and then hunt, fish, forage, barter the other half. So have calories stored. I don't know how many calories it takes to plant and harvest and grow a bag of potatoes or a bag of rice. I don't know how much manpower, labor, if you don't have any machines, goes into that. But I know it's a lot more than the labor it takes now to drive to the store and get dehydrated potatoes, a couple of bags of rice, beans, even if you don't eat that stuff day to day, and I don't advise you to. In a survival situation, I'm going to eat it. And that's your safer bet, especially in the acute beginning part of a big event like that. Wait till things have calmed down a bit before you try and go hunting and feed your family that way. That might be the better advice. Again, depending on the situation. Again, I don't see the future. But those are some thoughts on there. If you want to have this as part of your well thought out plan, and I think it should be, shotgun, maybe you want to go with the 22. If you think it's going to be untenable in your AO, your area of operation, you need to go somewhere else. It presents a whole other set of problems, but you may decide to go with the 22 for that reason. But shotgun is far easier in my opinion. That's had a lot of years of putting food on the table. The shotgun's just the most versatile. You also might want to store some fish hooks, some fishing line. If you plan on staying in your area, trapping can absolutely be a thing. I've done quite a bit of trapping. Trapping is hard. You had better have the skills. Just because you saw somebody say to have a spool of snare wire in their bug out bag and you have that, you think you can trap. Trapping is hard. Trapping is a long, slow learning curve. So you had better know how to do it pre-event, not when you're 3 days without food and starving to death. That's not the time to learn how to trap. But those absolutely, I think, should get some consideration, but also have some food. That's the easier solution. Food, you might complain about inflation or whatever now. It might be more expensive, but it's available. It's on a shelf. So probably store some. Anyway, those are some thoughts on survival, hunting, fishing, foraging. Same thing with foraging. Get good at it now when you can, have an app on your phone or a lot of resources where you can look up that plant, because a lot of plants look really delicious that will straight up kill you. Like nightshade. Looks like a delicious berry. Deadly. Some plants look absolutely disgusting and are delicious. Some are even painful, but really, really good and nutritious, like stinging nettle. You had better know that pre-event, like when you can look it up on a phone or the internet, or if you get sick, you can go to the hospital. Because when you haven't eaten in 3 days and you think this berry looks kind of edible and it's nightshade, you may make the wrong choice. So just like everything else, do it now. Get good at it now. It's, everybody wants to worry about the gear. What caliber should I get? What gun should I get? Can you even hunt? Can you even fish? Can you even forage now when times are good and you're not starving to death? I would rather be realistic with you than, paint some prepper fantasy like some novel where you have an endless bug out bag of MREs and women throw themselves at you. I don't know the apocalypse, or I don't know what a big collapse event is exactly going to look like, but it's probably not going to look like that. So be prepared for reality, not a prepper fantasy. And with that, tactical verse of the day. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Men, keep your Bibles open and your powder dry. Watch and be ready, and have a blessed day.